Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. Ivan had always been content with his life as a farmer in the small village of Valoria. The fields were fertile, the work was hard but rewarding, and the days passed in a rhythm that soothed his soul. He lived in a modest cottage at the edge of the village, where the rolling hills met the ancient forest that everyone knew but few dared to enter. It was a place of legends, filled with stories of old kings and forgotten battles, but to Ivan, it was simply home. The villagers often spoke of the stone sword, a mystical blade embedded in a large rock deep within the forest. The legend had been passed down through generations. Only the true king, chosen by fate, could pull the sword from the stone and unite the fractured kingdoms. Many had tried over the centuries, from mighty warriors to ambitious nobles, but the sword had never budged. It remained there, a silent sentinel, waiting for the one who was destined to wield it. Ivan had heard the stories countless times, but he had never given them much thought. His life was grounded in the soil, in the turning of the seasons, and in the care of his ailing mother. He had no desire for power, no ambition beyond the well-being of his small farm. He was known in the village for his kindness and humility, always ready to lend a hand to a neighbor in need. In return, the villagers respected him, but they did not see him as anything more than what he was, a simple farmer. One crisp autumn day, as the leaves turned golden and the air carried the scent of earth and wood smoke, Ivan decided to gather firewood for the coming winter. He left his farm early in the morning, with the sun just beginning to rise over the hills. The forest, though dense and shadowed, had always been a source of solace for him. It was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird, and it felt like a world apart from the worries and demands of daily life. As he wandered deeper into the forest, his thoughts drifted. He thought of his mother, who had grown frilier with each passing year, and of the life they had built together. He had never known his father, who had died before he was born, leaving his mother to raise him alone. She had done so with strength and grace, teaching him everything he knew about farming, about life. But now, as she grew older, Ivan found himself thinking more and more about the future, about what would happen when she was gone. Lost in thought, Ivan didn't realize how far he had wandered until he stumbled upon a clearing he had never seen before. It was small and circular, with a soft carpet of moss underfoot and a crown of ancient trees standing guard around it. In the center of the clearing, bathed in a shaft of sunlight that broke through the canopy, was the stone sword. Ivan stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. He had heard the stories, of course, but he had never imagined he would see the sword himself. It looked exactly as the legends described, a long, slender blade embedded in a massive stone, its hilt wrapped in worn leather, its surface etched with runes that glowed faintly in the light. The sight of it was both awe-inspiring and strangely unsettling. For a moment, Ivan simply stared at the sword, unsure of what to do. Part of him wanted to turn and leave, to pretend he had never found it, but another part, one he couldn't quite understand, compelled him to approach. His feet moved of their own accord, carrying him across the clearing until he stood before the stone. That he hesitated, his hand hovering over the hilt. What was he doing? He was just a farmer, not a warrior, not a king. The sword wasn't meant for someone like him. And yet, something deep inside him urged him to grasp the hilt, to feel its weight in his hand. With a deep breath, Ivan wrapped his fingers around the hilt. The leather was cool to the touch, the runes pulsing gently beneath his palm. He closed his eyes, took another breath, and pulled. To his astonishment, the sword slid out of the stone as if it had been waiting for him all along. The blade gleamed in the sunlight, the runes glowing brighter as they seemed to hum with life. Ivan staggered back, nearly dropping the sword in his shock. He stared at it, unable to comprehend what had just happened. He had done it. He had pulled the stone sword from the stone. But what did that mean? What was he supposed to do now? As he stood there, the weight of the sword in his hand, Ivan felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, confusion, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. It was as if the sword had awakened something within him, something that had been dormant for a long time, but before he could dwell on it any further, the sound of rustling leaves broke the silence. Ivan spun around, sword at the ready, to find himself surrounded by a group of men. They were dressed in fine clothes, their faces stern and serious, and they all carried swords of their own. Ivan recognized them as the king's men, nobles and knights from the neighboring kingdom who often patrolled the borders of Valoria. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the sword in Ivan's hand. "You there," he said, his voice commanding. "Who are you, and how did you come to possess that sword?" Ivan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was still reeling from what had just happened, and now he was faced with a group of armed men demanding answers he didn't have. "I'm just a farmer," Ivan finally managed to say. "I found the sword." "I didn't mean to." The scarred man narrowed his eyes, clearly not satisfied with Ivan's explanation. "That sword is the symbol of kingship," he said. "Only the true king can pull it from the stone. You must come with us to the capital. The king will want to see you." Ivan's heart sank. The last thing he wanted was to be dragged into the affairs of the kingdom. He had no desire to be king, no interest in power or politics. All he wanted was to return to his farm and care for his mother. But it was clear that these men were not going to let him go so easily. Reluctantly, Ivan nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll come with you." The journey to the capital was long and arduous. The king's men rode on horseback, but they gave Ivan no such luxury. He had to walk, the stone sword strapped to his back, its weight growing heavier with each passing mile. The men kept a close watch on him, their eyes always on the sword, as if they expected him to do something with it, though he had no idea what that might be. As they traveled, Ivan's thoughts raced. What was he going to say to the king? How could he explain what had happened when he didn't even understand it himself? And what would happen when they arrived? Would they expect him to take the throne, to lead armies and make decisions that would affect the lives of thousands? He wanted nothing to do with it. He was a farmer, not a ruler. The thought of being responsible for so many lives filled him with dread. But there was no turning back now. The sword had chosen him, and whether he liked it or not, he would have to face whatever challenges lay ahead. When they finally reached the capital, Ivan was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The city was vast, with towering walls and grand buildings that seemed to reach the sky. It was a far cry from the simple life he had known in Valoria, and the sight of it only served to deepen his sense of unease. The king's men led him through the bustling streets, past markets and shops, until they reached the palace. It was an imposing structure, built of stone and marble, with tall spires and intricate carvings. Ivan had never seen anything like it, and he couldn't help but feel small and out of place as they entered the grand hall. The king was seated on a throne at the far end of the hall, flanked by advisors and guards. He was an older man, with gray hair and a stern expression, his eyes sharp and discerning. As Ivan approached, the king's gaze fell on the stone sword, and his expression hardened. "Is this the man?" the king asked, his voice deep and resonant. The scarred man who had brought Ivan nodded. "Yes, your majesty." He pulled the sword from the stone. The king studied Ivan for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. "What is your name, boy?" "Ivan," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just a farmer, from Valoria." The king raised an eyebrow. A farmer? And yet you wield the stone sword, a weapon that has remained untouched for centuries. How do you explain that? Ivan shook his head, feeling the weight of the sword pressing down on him. I can't explain it, Your Majesty. I didn't mean to. I didn't want this. I just found the sword and pulled it out. I'm not a king. The king leaned back in his throne, his expression thoughtful. Perhaps not. But the sword chose you for a reason. Whether you want it or not, you are now a part of something much larger than yourself. The kingdoms are in turmoil, torn apart by war and division. A true king is needed to restore order, to bring peace. And the sword has declared you that king. Ivan's heart pounded in his chest. This was exactly what he had feared. He didn't want to be king, didn't want the responsibility that came with it. But how could he refuse? How could he deny the sword, the legend, and the expectations of so many people? I don't know if I'm the right person for this, Ivan said, his voice trembling. I don't know if I can be the king you need. The king's eyes softened, and for a moment, Ivan thought he saw a glimmer of understanding. The choice is not yours alone, the king said. But it is a heavy burden, and not one to be taken lightly. You must decide if you are willing to carry it, to face the challenges that will come. The kingdom needs a leader, but only if that leader is willing to serve. Ivan felt a lump form in his throat. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, heavier than the sword on his back. He had always been content with his life as a farmer, with the simplicity and the peace it brought. But now, standing in the grand hall of the palace, he realized that his life had changed forever. There was no going back. I need time to think, Ivan said, his voice barely audible. Please, Your Majesty. I'm not ready to decide. The king nodded, his expression unreadable. Very well. You will be given time. But remember, the kingdom does not have the luxury of waiting forever. War is on the horizon, and the people need a leader. When you are ready, the sword will guide you. Ivan was dismissed, and he was led to a small chamber in the palace where he could rest. But rest did not come easily. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and fears, doubts and uncertainties. He had never asked for this, had never wanted to be anything more than what he was. But the sword had chosen him, and now he had to decide whether to accept that choice or to walk away. Days passed, and Ivan remained in the palace, grappling with the enormity of the decision before him. He was visited by advisors, nobles, and even commoners, all of whom had their own opinions about what he should do. Some urged him to take the throne, to embrace his destiny as the true king. Others warned him of the dangers, of the enemies who would seek to destroy him if he dared to claim the crown, but amid all the noise and the pressure, one voice stood out. It belonged to an old man named Eldrick, who came to Ivan one evening as he sat alone in the chamber, staring at the stone sword that lay on the table before him. You look troubled, young man, Eldrick said, his voice gentle and wise. Ivan looked up, surprised to see the old man standing in the doorway. Who are you? He asked. My name is Eldrick, the man replied, stepping into the room. I was once an advisor to the last true king, before the kingdoms fell into chaos. I have seen many rulers come and go, some great, some not. And I have seen the burden of the crown weigh heavily on those who were not prepared to bear it. Ivan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what to do, Eldrick. I never wanted any of this. I just want to go back to my farm, to my life. But now, everything has changed. Eldrick nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. Change is inevitable, especially when one is called to greatness. But greatness is not always about power or glory. It is about the choices we make, the sacrifices we are willing to endure for the greater good. The sword chose you for a reason, Ivan. But it is up to you to discover that reason, to decide if you are willing to accept it. Ivan looked at the sword, its runes still glowing faintly in the dim light of the chamber. But why me? I'm just a farmer. I don't know anything about ruling a kingdom, about leading people. How can I possibly be the king they need? Eldrick smiled, a knowing smile that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. Sometimes, it is the simple and humble who are best suited to lead. A king must understand the needs of his people, must be willing to serve them, not rule over them. You have the heart of a farmer, Ivan, but that heart is what makes you worthy of the sword. You must trust in yourself, and in the path that has been laid before you. Ivan considered Eldrick's words, feeling a small spark of hope flicker within him. Perhaps there was something more to him than he had realized. Perhaps the sword had seen something in him that he had not yet seen in himself. But how do I know if I'm making the right choice? Ivan asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. You will know, Eldrick replied. When the time comes, you will know. The sword will guide you, as it has guided others before you. But you must be willing to listen, to trust in the wisdom it offers. Ivan nodded, still unsure but feeling a sense of resolve beginning to form. Thank you, Eldrick. I will think on what you've said. Eldrick bowed his head. Take your time, Ivan. But remember, the kingdom needs you. And the sword will wait for your decision. With that, Eldrick left the chamber, leaving Ivan alone with his thoughts once more. But this time, there was a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose that had not been there before. Ivan knew that he could not ignore the call of the sword, could not simply walk away from the responsibility that had been placed upon him. But he also knew that he needed to understand more, to learn more before he could make his choice. The next morning, Ivan sought out Eldrick and told him of his decision. I need to know more, Ivan said. About the sword, about the kingdoms, about what it means to be a king. I want to visit the ruins of the first kingdom, where the sword was forged. Perhaps there, I will find the answers I seek. Eldrick nodded, a look of approval in his eyes. A wise choice, Ivan. The journey will not be easy, but it will be necessary. You will learn much along the way, and when you return, you will be ready to make your decision. And so, Ivan set out on his journey, accompanied by Eldrick and a small group of loyal companions. They left the capital and traveled across the land, through forests and mountains, across rivers and plains. The journey was long and arduous, but Ivan's resolve never wavered. He knew that he needed to understand the true nature of the sword, to discover why it had chosen him. Along the way, Ivan learned much about the history of the kingdoms, about the wars that had torn them apart, and about the ancient kings who had once ruled with wisdom and justice. He listened to the stories of those they met on the road, travelers, villagers, soldiers, and he began to see the larger picture, to understand the gravity of the situation. But despite all he learned, there was still doubt in his heart. He still questioned whether he was the right person to lead, whether he had the strength and wisdom to guide the kingdom through its darkest hour. Finally, after many weeks of travel, they arrived at the ruins of the first kingdom. The place was a desolate wasteland, the remnants of a once great city now reduced to crumbling walls and broken statues. But there was a sense of power here, a sense of history that seemed to hang in the air like a heavy mist. In the center of the ruins stood a great temple, its doors still intact despite the passage of time. Ivan felt a strange pull, as if the sword were guiding him, and he led the group inside. The temple was dark and cold, the air thick with the scent of ancient stone. But at the far end of the hall, in a chamber bathed in a soft, ethereal light, Ivan saw what he had been searching for. There, on a pedestal carved from the same stone as the sword, lay an ancient book, its pages worn and yellowed with age. The cover was adorned with the same runes that were etched into the sword, and Ivan knew immediately that this book held the answers he sought. With trembling hands, Ivan opened the book and began to read. The words were written in a language he did not understand, but as he ran his fingers over the runes, the meaning became clear in his mind. The book told the story of the first king, a man of humble origins who had been chosen by the gods to unite the warring tribes and create a kingdom that would stand the test of time. The first king had been a farmer, like Ivan, a man who had never sought power but had accepted it when it was thrust upon him. He had ruled with wisdom and compassion, using the sword not as a weapon of war but as a symbol of peace and unity. He had brought the tribes together, forging alliances and settling disputes, and under his rule, the kingdom had flourished. But the book also spoke of the burden the king had borne, the weight of the crown that had pressed down on him until it became too much to bear. In the end, the king had passed the sword on to his son, but not before leaving a warning. The sword was a tool of destiny, but it could also be a curse. Only those who were truly worthy could wield it without being consumed by its power. As Ivan read these words, he felt a deep connection to the first king, as if their lives were intertwined by fate. He understood now why the sword had chosen him, why it had called him to this place. It was not just about being a king, not just about ruling over others. It was about serving the people, about using the power of the sword to bring peace and justice, to unite the fractured kingdoms, but it was also about the burden, the sacrifice that would be required. Ivan knew that if he accepted the sword, if he took on the mantle of king, his life would never be the same. He would be giving up his simple life, his freedom, for the sake of the kingdom. It was a heavy price to pay, and one that he was not sure he was willing to pay. As Ivan closed the book and looked at the sword, he felt a sense of clarity, a sense of peace that he had not felt before. He knew now what he had to do, but he also knew that the choice was his alone. The sword had chosen him, but he had the power to choose his own path. With a deep breath, Ivan turned to Eldrick and his companions. "I understand now," he said, his voice steady and sure. "The sword chose me because it saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. But I also know that I have the power to choose my own destiny. I will return to Valoria, and I will make my decision there." Eldrick nodded, a look of pride in his eyes. "You have grown much on this journey, Ivan. Whatever decision you make, it will be the right one." And so, they began the journey back to Valoria. Ivan felt a sense of purpose, a sense of determination that had been absent before. He knew that the kingdom was depending on him, that the fate of many rested on his shoulders. But he also knew that he had the strength to make the right choice, to do what was best for the people. When they finally arrived in Valoria, they found the village in turmoil. Rival factions had gathered, each vying for control, each claiming the right to the throne. The people were divided, torn between loyalty and fear, and the threat of violence hung heavy in the air. Ivan wasted no time. He called for a gathering in the village square, where he stood before the people, the stone sword in his hand. The crowd fell silent as they saw the sword, as they realized that the man before them was the one who had pulled it from the stone. "Ivan, the farmer," someone whispered, and the name spread through the crowd like wildfire. Ivan raised the sword high, its runes glowing brightly in the twilight. "I did not ask for this," he began, his voice clear and strong. "I never wanted to be king, never sought power or glory. I am a farmer, like many of you. But the sword chose me, and I have come to understand why. He paused, looking out at the faces in the crowd, the faces of his friends and neighbors, of the people he had grown up with, the people he had worked alongside. The kingdom is in chaos, he continued. War is on the horizon, and the people are suffering. We need a leader, someone who will unite us, who will bring peace and justice to the land. But that leader must be someone who is willing to serve, not to rule. Ivan lowered the sword, letting the tip rest on the ground. I do not want to be your king, he said, his voice filled with conviction. But I am willing to serve you, to use the power of the sword to bring us together, to restore what has been lost. I ask you to stand with me, not as your king, but as your fellow man, as someone who wants what is best for all of us. The crowd murmured, uncertain, but Ivan could see the hope in their eyes, the longing for something better. He knew that the choice he was offering them was not an easy one, but it was the right one. I will return the sword to the stone, Ivan said, raising the blade once more. And if I am truly meant to lead, if the sword believes that I am worthy, it will remain with me. But if not, it will choose another, and I will return to my farm, knowing that I have done my best. With those words, Ivan turned and walked to the edge of the village, where the ancient stone still stood, waiting. The crowd followed, silent and expectant, their eyes fixed on the man who held their future in his hands. Ivan approached the stone, feeling the weight of the sword, the weight of the decision he was about to make. He knew that whatever happened next would change everything, that his life would never be the same. But he was ready. He had made his choice. With a steady hand, Ivan placed the sword back into the stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the sword began to glow, its runes pulsing with light. The crowd gasped as the sword seemed to sink into the stone, as if it were being pulled by some unseen force. But then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The sword remained embedded in the stone, its hilt still visible, its runes still glowing. But there was something different about it now, something that Ivan couldn't quite explain. It was as if the sword had accepted his choice, had acknowledged the path he had chosen. Ivan stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at the sword, at the crowd, and then at Eldrick, who stood watching with a knowing smile. Ivan, the sword has chosen you, Eldrick said, his voice filled with pride. Not as a king, but as a leader, as someone who will guide us through these troubled times. The people will follow you, not because you wield the sword, but because you have shown them the way. Ivan felt a sense of relief, of peace. He knew now that he had made the right choice, that he had found his true calling. He would not be a king, but he would be a leader, a servant of the people, someone who would use the power of the sword to bring peace and justice to the land. As the sun set over Valoria, casting a golden glow over the village, Ivan stood before his people, ready to lead them into a new era. The sword remained in the stone, a symbol of hope, of unity, and of the power of choice. And as Ivan looked out at the faces of his friends and neighbors, he knew that together, they would build a future worthy of the sword's legacy.